What's up?
Hey, I just need you to tell me exactly what to say to this girl. Do I keep just giving her grace, or do I just tell her the truth?
Well, Jesus is both fully grace and fully truth at the same time. It's not just black and white like you want it to be. It's gray.
Well, I don't know about you, but one of my favorite pastimes is people watching. I just like to observe and see what's going down, and it really in any element. I mean, there's kind of the classic, the airport and two people are united. It's like, okay, yeah, I like to watch the drama, to be honest. That is fun. I don't know if it's fun, but when you're not involved in it, when you're watching and you can kind of see in somebody's reaction, or maybe you've been a part of this, and we've all been a part of it at different times, but when somebody says something that's just unexpected, it's like, man, where did that come from? And oftentimes it comes from the more different than the person's normal temperament, the more it kind of stands out. And you can see people's reaction. And somebody maybe who's typically very mild-mannered, they're calm, they're all this stuff, and all of a sudden they're like, and they blow up, and you're like, what happened to Millie? She was so calm and tranquil, right? Or you have somebody, and then they say something, and they're usually, they're fine, they're secure, they're confident. They just say something it's deeply insecure, or it's deeply frustrated, or maybe they're like, you're like, man, I have an aunt, and if you don't know how to call your aunt this thing where you really just want to say they're really mean, right? You just say they're really prickly, right? You have somebody in your life that's incredibly prickly, right? And then you see them, and then they say something that's just like the nicest thing, and you're like, what happened to prickly aunt? That doesn't even really fully make sense. And what's interesting is Jesus actually talks about this. He says it in a way that's a little bit different. And he talks about it in the Gospel of Luke, because I think we've all experienced this kind of, where did it come from? Where did that come from? It was wild. It was a little bit unpredictable. It was a little bit unforeseen. But the social filter internally breaks down, and something just, comes out that you didn't really know it was there. The people around you didn't really know it was there. Jesus, in Luke chapter 6, he's talking. He says, man, there's a commonality with this. He says, for no good tree, Luke chapter 6, verse 43, bears bad fruit. Nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its fruit. Now, I know that's groundbreaking for everybody in here, right? What, In other words, this is like one of those little cutie type oranges. I don't even know if it's a tangerine, if it's satsuma, it's something. I'm calling it an orange, but it's a cutie, right? We tend to go through these. We're a little bit streaky, but when we are on them in our household, we go through them like water. It's just, we've had enough Doritos and honey grams, whatever it is, right? And Nutella on everything. So we're just like, hey, here's an orange, and our kids just start to devouring. And our kids have never peeled open one of these, or more so said, Dad, can you open this for me? And said, there's a grape in here. Man, Dad, I was eating this, and I opened it up, and it was a Milky Way. It was a Snickers, right? Every time they've opened one of these, it's been an orange. No matter what you do, what happens inside of here comes out. And so Jesus says this. He says, for each tree is known by its fruit. Figs, by the way, if a bad tree, bad fruit, good tree, good fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from bramble bush. The good person, out of the good treasure of his heart, produces good. Or the evil person, out of the evil treasure, produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. This is his point. When it's wild and it's crazy and it's volatile, then you can tell because it came from within. Where did that come from? We always ask. Where did that come from? Never would have expected it. The truth is it came from in here. Something was happening, and finally the social filter broke down, and there was enough squeeze, there was enough stress, there was enough pressure, and what came out of it, Jesus says, it's from the overflow of the heart. By the way, before we get too much farther, let me just introduce myself. My name is Ben, and I do have the honor of serving as the lead pastor here at DCC, and we are kicking off a new series, and the reason I wanted to open with that is because post-Easter, I wanted to do something that was helpful for everybody who's, no matter where you are in faith. If you are the person who walked in here for the very first time, or you're still in the exploratory phase, not really sure where you are, what you believe, you're hesitant, critical, skeptical, whatever it might be, but you're asking a bunch of questions. Or the person who has been faithfully following Jesus for a long time, and like you know the Lord, and you have been following him, and it's your heart's desire to serve him. Like, what can we do that's helpful for everybody? And as I was thinking about this, I think the push behind it was, we as Jesus followers, when people see us, they should see Jesus, right? When people see us, they should see people who are more like Jesus. And though that's generally speaking like the idea, the truth is that a lot of times people look at us and they don't see Jesus. They look at us, they don't see the same type of love, they don't see the same type of grace, they don't see, like whatever it might be, but they don't necessarily see Jesus in us. And as I was thinking about it, there's a bunch of times where we read the Bible and it's here's the individual lesson. Here's Jesus' parable, and here's the one thing he's trying to teach about prayer. Here's Jesus' parable, and here's the lesson he's trying to teach about forgiveness. Here's Jesus' parable, and here's what he's trying to teach about diligence or gifts or the kingdom, right? Here's the individual lessons through these interactions and transactions about faith or about life or about spirituality. But rarely do we just pull back and say, okay, almost the entire gospel narratives are Jesus interacting with people. And we look at them into their individuality, but not on the meta, and just say, how did Jesus interact with people in general? And honestly, I think the reason is because it feels impossible. And by that I don't mean like being as loving as Jesus is or as forgiving. Those things are impossible too, to execute to his level. But just in general, if you think about it, he was just confusing, to be honest. And I don't mean that in like an irreligious way, because I don't think he was by any means unintentional. It was just unpredictable at times. For instance, if you were here in the Gospel of John, we were going through a series in the fall called Signs. Signs, not just here's a miracle, but signs because they pointed to something beyond themselves. They substantiated the messenger, and they also clarified the message, and this is the things that Jesus did. And the very first sign he does, Jesus is at this party. Jesus is at a wedding, Cana of Galilee. And they've been there for a little while, long enough for the entire party and the attendants have had enough to drink, and not just like hydrating with water. They've had enough wine to drink that they've run out. And Jesus' mama looks at him and says, Jesus, go turn this basically water into wine. Jesus starts and says, my time has not yet come. He's more so talking about is the end. And so what ends up happening is Jesus says, okay, and then he turns, not just like, okay, here's a little bit of leftovers. He turns hundreds of bottles worth of water into wine. They were in these big gallons they had multiple of them, held 60 to 70 gallons per barrel. And Jesus looks at them, and he turns this like more than they would be able to consume. Jesus turns water into wine. Now, just imagine, pause. You are the infinite God. You are God of the universe. You are God of the cosmos. You sustain, you hold, you created everything by the power of your hand and the power of your mighty word. Like, you are God. And you can do anything with your first miracle. And you preserve a party to last longer with wine. I don't care who you are. Theologically, it's like, I don't know. I don't know where I am with that. You know what's crazy? It's the next thing he does. He goes to church, which some of you are like, yeah, that's why I'm here too. Just glad you're here. And he, seeing these people who they hadn't had too much wine, they were taking this idea of people coming to the temple to sacrifice, and people perhaps didn't bring anything to sacrifice. Maybe they brought money, and they were overcharging, and so they were kind of using. But he goes into the temple. And he grabs the tables, he throws them up, he just wrecks the place. He turns stuff into a whip, and he drives everybody out. And so it's like, well, which Jesus am I supposed to be? Like the party's going on, Jesus water to wine Jesus? Or am I the, throw things over at the temple and going to church and just creating, a bunch of havoc Jesus? Like which of those Jesus? In fact, it goes on in the next couple of miracles. One miracle, he has this guy who's this Roman official, comes to him, and he walks probably 10, 15, 20, maybe 40, up to 40 miles from where he was to get to where Jesus is. He says, Jesus, my son is sick. I mean, it shows and demonstrates the faith that he has heard and that he is going to this Nazarene Jewish carpenter and saying, can you heal my son? I mean, just an incredible level of humility and sacrifice to get there. And Jesus looks at him and he says, your generation, you're never going to believe unless you see. To which I would be like, Jesus, I came all the way here because I believe. And the guy looks at Jesus and he says, hey, will you please heal my son? He says, your son's already healed, go. Says the man believed Jesus and he walked away. So this man's sacrifice gets pushed back. Then Jesus goes to this other pool. This pool where a bunch of people who have been disabled for a long time, this one particular person for basically his entire life has never been able to walk, has never been able to get up, and he looks at him and he says, with this guy doing no thing, no effort, no anything, no faith, he just looks at him and he says, do you want to be made well? The guy never says, yes, because I believe that you're the Son of God, you have the power to heal, to restore, to make right again. No, he just looks at him. And he says, well, here's why I can't. Because every time that something happens and the water gets stirred and there's nobody to put me down there, and so Jesus just says, okay, get up and walk. Well, hold on, Jesus. This guy walked, did a bunch of stuff, came and asked you a question in faith, humbled himself. The other person you walked up to, he just laid there. He didn't even answer with faith. We have no clue that he has any indication of who you are. And you heal him, almost without him even asking. So which one are we supposed to be? We're supposed to be like Jesus. Because the truth is, isn't this true? And if you're not reading anything right now, I would say this. Read through. This is what I say all the time. Read the Bible for yourself, please. Not just because I want you to read the Bible, I do. Because it changes how you view God. Read the Gospel of John, just one chapter at a time. And you're going to discover he says some wild stuff. Sometimes he is so much more gracious than I would think. And sometimes he is so much more, it seems like brutally honest than I would want to be. Sometimes he heals when I would think he isn't. Sometimes he is pushed back when I would think he's just going to be obvious and clear. And it's this interesting just dichotomy, this push and pull, and this who and how is he going to react. And so it was funny because as I was thinking, this is why when you experience Christians, by the way, if you're here and you're kind of checking out faith, or maybe you've recently come back to faith, and for the longest time Christians were a problem, and you thought, how is it that Christians can be so different? You have some people who are so incredibly judgmental and some people who are so incredibly loving. How is it that both can exist? And the truth is, it's because some people see one side and some people see the other side, and there's both of these that happen concurrently. So how do we even begin to say, what does it look like to walk like Jesus walked in this incredibly nuanced, in this incredibly complex world we live in? That we take the thoughts and the ideas of a Jewish rabbi and integrate them in a world of digitization, AI, social media, and cryptocurrency, right? It's complex. It's tough. There's judgment, and there's so much gray. And then I remembered, from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. From the abundance of what's inside is what comes out, which means this. When I am surprised by how Jesus acts and interacts, when I'm surprised at what he says, when I read and he's more gracious than I would be, or when I read when he is more critical than I would be, when I read and he just seems like, Jesus, do you even know that these people have done anything wrong? Or when I read that I'm like, Jesus, you're really going on how wrong these people are. When I am surprised by his reactions and interactions, it means that there was something inside of him that was creating that. And there's something inside of me that's creating something different. Because from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. From the abundance of what's inside, it always comes out. So what I want to do in this first time together is just talk about, for Jesus, what was on the inside. What was on the inside? And we can say God, of course. Yeah, for sure. Thankfully, John, who wrote the Gospel of John, and it was kind of the last one we believe chronologically to be written, but it's almost like John, who is, most of the disciples at this point had been killed. John was exiled, most likely at this point, and he's writing this document saying, okay, let me tell you about this God. Let me tell you about this God that I've seen, and I've known, and I've understood. This was John who, By the way, if you're here for Easter, this is the same guy who got to the tomb first. He outran you. That's John, right? John, interestingly, in the Gospel of John, he lays his head on Jesus' chest so he can hear the heartbeat of the Savior of the world before he dies. And then he sees him in Revelation and he falls over as if he's dead because he experiences his holiness. John has this awareness of Jesus. And so John then writes the Gospel of John to help us to kind of understand who is this person and how did he operate. And he brings everybody into the conversation in John chapter 1, verse 1, when he says, in the beginning, before existence existed, there was existence, and in the beginning was, and he says, the Word. That idea, the word is logos in the Greek. That was a dual meaning for the people, the nation of Israel, the Jewish folk of their day. They understood this, in a sense, to mean the Word. This was the essence, this was the breath, this was the life, this was God. He said in the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and was he God or was he with God? He says, yes, it was God. And so he's saying, okay, this is a way to express the idea of God, but for the Greek audience, interestingly, they also believed in this idea of logos, but they thought it more meant just like the mind, the reason. Sometimes maybe for us when we say the universe, right? Well, we kind of, people mean, I think in terms of, I'll pause here. One, we don't really define what we mean when we mean that kind of stuff. It's called street philosophy, which means we just kind of be like, this is about what we think. And basically means like this cognitive reason, some type of a reason that exists behind the universe. So John's saying, hey, that God, he's always existed. In chapter 1, verse 14, he says this. He says, and the Word, the Logos, the God that has always existed, became flesh, took on flesh. He didn't become the Logos, he didn't become God, but in being God, he took on flesh. And he did this, and he dwelt among us. Now, that word dwelt is not like a word that we oftentimes use. It's not like, hey, where y'all dwelling later, right? Where y'all want to dwell at for lunch? What's interesting is that word dwelt actually had an Old Testament. It actually meant tabernacled, tent. In the Old Testament, there was this wild thing. All the other gods, for the longest time, all the other gods had these temples, they had these places, they had these monuments, they had these statues, they had these places of worship. But God's like, no, I want to be amongst, I want to dwell with my people. And so God, for the longest time, was known as kind of the tent God. He was the God of the tabernacle. He was the God of the tent. It was a tent that wherever they would go as they were kind of going around in different places and different spaces, and even for a time when they had their promised land, they just had this tent, this tabernacle, that was the physical manifestation of the presence of God. And so he says, okay, in the same way that God in his fullness, that God in his presence dwelt with the people in this tent, he has now tented among us in the flesh and in the person of Jesus. So God in the person. And he says in this, and we have seen his glory. In other words, this is God, this is Logos, that God became one of us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is like this splendor, it's like this beauty, but as much as anything, it's this awareness of the fullness of the character and the perfection of God. It is the sense that if you were to take all of the character and all of the characteristics, the beauty, the creativity, the love, the patience, the justice, the righteousness, the holiness, the forgiveness, all of those, he says, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son. In other words, glory that it's like we have seen the image of God in the Son. We have seen the Father. We understand the Father because we have seen the Son. And then it's like he pauses. And it's almost like, man, how do I describe this idea of glory? How do I describe this idea of the character of God? How do I really conceptualize and understand this? We've seen his glory, he would say, as of the only Son from the Father. And this is the best way I can describe it, and we would say he could describe it. He was full of two things, grace and truth. In other words, if you want to understand that what's in here comes out here, if you want to understand how Jesus acted and how Jesus interacted, if you want to understand what it looks like, then you need to know this. that the person of Jesus was the representation and was the person of God in the flesh, that he revealed to us the Father. And John said, I've seen him, I've followed him, I've walked around. And let me tell you what's inside of this. It is grace and truth. Grace and truth. You see, we, back in, I guess like the 90s into the 2000s, it wasn't like ironically cool. It was actually cool to wear these things called "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets. I know. I was around when they were new. What's interesting is they had to start to ask that question because we live in a complex world. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? And again, it's always difficult to tell because how did he react? It seemed like it was off, or it seemed like it was on, or it seemed like it was harsh, or it seemed like it was, accepting, or it's just all over the place. What would Jesus do? I'll tell you what he would do every time. What he did every time was respond in grace and in truth. And so a lot of what we're going to go in this series is starting to unpack. How did Jesus interact with people? How did Jesus interact with the religious self-righteous? What did grace and truth look like in that? How did Jesus act with the people who were notoriously sinful, who everybody in the community looked and said, that person is a person who is not a religious person because they're far too sinful to be a religious person? And how did Jesus look at grace and truth of that? How did he look at that with his disciples? How did that look with his family? How did that look with the government? How did that look with everybody and in every area? Grace and truth. Now, what I think is interesting in this is if you think about it, we feel a tension between these two things all the time, I think. Or, I'd say more so, we try to avoid feeling a tension between these two things all the time. What I find is that in the Christians, and this is probably true of people who, beyond faith, but just talk about the people of faith, we have truth people, and we have grace people. We have people to hold to what's true, and we have people that just say, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, right? There's this sense of you have some folks, and these people, and they're just like, somebody's got to tell them, and so I'm going to tell them. They're the person you actually kind of don't want to tell. And then you have grace people, and you could be like, yeah, I killed your dog and slapped your kid. And they'd be like, hey, it's okay. It's just hug. And you're like, I don't think that's okay. You just don't. Isn't this true? Some of us, we're deeply truth people. And here's kind of what happens. And the funny part is the grace people have thoughts about the truth people, and the truth people have thoughts about the grace people. And I'll just say what everybody has thought in those two camps because of the fact that, here I am with the microphone. Grace people, right? Let's start with truth people. Truth people. Let's start with grace people, right? Yeah, you're easier. Truth people, I got to warm up to you guys. Grace people, right? You look at the truth people, and you think, and you hear what they say, and they say, well, hey, somebody had to tell them the truth. Somebody had to tell them the truth. And you're thinking, that's not the truth. That's being a jerk. There's 500 different ways to tell the truth. You just pick the most abrasive, the least thoughtful, the least empathetic way to possibly say this. That's not true. That is mean. And the truth people? Well, somebody had to tell them, right? Okay, maybe, but at least somebody cares about the other person enough to actually tell them the honest truth. And I love you enough to not make you happy, but to be honest with you. Some of us are truth people. Some of our grace people. But here was what was so magnificent and incredible. Here's what was so winsome about Jesus. It's this sense, this internal confidence, this non-anxious presence. Here's what was so winsome about Jesus. He was full. Full. Not the balance, not the blend, not 50-50. He was the fullness of grace. And he was the fullness of truth. And in all of his interactions, this is what was displayed. And our tendency is to want to resolve this inner tension, to want to pick grace or to pick truth. But if we ever solve that tension, we lose. Randy Alcorn has this book called the Grace and Truth Paradox, and he has this quote that I thought was great with it. He says, truth without grace breeds a self-righteous legalism that poisons the church and pushes the world away from Christ. And it is true. Some of you have church hurt because you experienced a truth person. And you were going through something. And there was truth in what they said. But the truth is, there was no grace in what they said. And they said what was true, but they didn't say it in a way that actually embodied the heart and the person of Jesus. And so because of that, it was deeply hurtful, because at the time that you needed, be honest, the time you needed somebody to just empathize and give you a hug, you had somebody that told you that you were a sinner and that you needed to repent now. Granted, categorically true. Probably not the most helpful thing in the moment. Because of that, you thought if Christians were like that, I don't want to be anything like them. That's the truth. That's the problem. And truth internally creates self-righteousness, by the way. Because it means that I know right. I know wrong. And there are places where God is very clear about that. The other problem, he says if legalism, that poisons the church and pushes away from the world of Christ, grace without truth breeds moral indifference and keeps people from seeing their need for Christ. Right? My experience is people who are grace people, you've got a heart and you don't want to hurt the other person, so you don't want to, offend. You don't want to maybe tell them the truth. Maybe you've experienced church hurt in the opposite direction, which is that you were at that place for a long time, and no one ever was just honest with you. No one ever just said, this is where we are. No one ever just said, this is what we believe. No one ever just said, this is the gospel. And because of that, right, everything was true, everything was kind of right, and everything was whatever. And it really just became this ruinous empathy. This is, I think, this is far too broad, but I'll just say categorically. The stereotypes are that the older you are, the older generations, you care about truth. Is it true? Is it true? In fact, isn't this right? 15, 20 years ago, to convince somebody to become a Christian, it's this is why it's true, this is why it's true. Convince me that it's true. Now it's a little bit more of, does it work for my life and my lifestyle? Show me that it's functional. Right? It's this more nuanced version. It's just more whatever. And so the older generation has a tendency to over-index on truth. The younger generations have a tendency to over-index on nuance and grace. Because if we can understand why you are that way, it doesn't matter what happened. And so it's grace, 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 grace. And the problem with that